Shalom, this is Rabbi Azriel Rosner coming to you from Ramat Beit Shemesh, and this is the fifth in a series of shiurim about the Sheish Zechirot, the six things that we are supposed to remember. Today we're going to talk about the mitzvah of remembering Miriam. Now, this takes us back to the story in Sefer Bamidbar about Miriam and Moshe Rabbeinu. Miriam in the story spoke Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu. What exactly she said is a machloket between the Mefarshim and not our topic right now. But because of that Lashon Hara, Miriam was punished with tzarat, a skin disease, and she was sent out of the camp for a week until she healed. And that is one of the sources that the punishment for Lashon Hara, for speaking negatively about other people, is tzarat. In our pasuk, Sefer Dvarim, Perek Chavdalid pasuk Tet, it says, "Zachor et asher asa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam, baderech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim." Remember what God did to Miriam on the path, on the road, on your way out of Mitzrayim. But what exactly are we supposed to remember about Miriam, and why do we have to remember this specifically? We all know that Lashon Hara, speaking negatively about other people, is a terrible aveira. But there are many terrible averot out there. Avodah Zarah, murder. Why is there specifically a mitzvah zechira related to this incident? And why do we have to remember, if this is all about Lashon Hara, why do we have to remember that Miriam herself sinned? We all know of the greatness of Miriam. She was a great tzaddiket. She was a nevi'ah, a prophet. The Torah describes her as a woman of great wisdom, of great emunah, and of course she was a great leader of her time. So why do we want to remember this sin of hers? Isn't it embarrassing to her? Don't we want to remember the many, many great things she did and not the relatively small bad thing? The Ramban, in his Perush on this pasuk, puts the stress on the Aveira of Lashon Hara. He writes that the real mitzvah here is not remembering Miriam's act as much as learning from it, learning not to speak Lashon Hara. And this, of course, is a very important lesson for all of us. We all know that we speak way too often and way too negatively about other people. So certainly it's a good lesson to learn to not speak Lashon Hara. But again, why do we have to remember Miriam's speech and Miriam's punishment as a way of remembering not to speak Lashon Hara? Why wouldn't the pasuk just say, remember to not speak Lashon Hara? So the Ramban explains that Miriam's example is given because her act of Lashon Hara was relatively minor and relatively minimal. First of all, she spoke on behalf of her sister-in-law Tzipora in order to help her out. And her intentions were absolutely good. She didn't mean to disparage Moshe Rabbeinu. She meant to try to correct a situation that was going on and that she thought that her brother Moshe might be making a mistake. She really did have a question about Moshe's actions, and she really did want to help him out. And finally, she only spoke to one person, not to a vast crowd. And who was that one person? It was her brother Aaron, who was also a family member, and also had Moshe's best interests in mind. If we put all that together, it really does seem that Miriam's act of Lashon Hara was really, in the grand scheme of things, seems to be relatively minor compared to other people who speak Lashon Hara very often, and maybe ourselves too, who really do mean to disparage people, who maybe speak in much greater forums. So her Avera seems to be quite minor. And not to mention that she was such a tzaddiket the vast majority of the time, overwhelming majority. And yet, says the Ramban, we note that she was still punished by Hashem for speaking Lashon Hara. And we learn from this that if even Miriam was held accountable for her one very minor act of Lashon Hara, then so too we. After all, her misstatement was minor and with good intentions and in a relatively private setting. And yet, Hashem said, everything counts. All of our actions are relevant. And so too, then Kal v'chomer, we should be so cautious about what comes out of our mouths, about what we say about other people. So if this is the case, why does the pasuk specifically mention the example of Miriam? Not to chas v'sholom denigrate Miriam, not to chas v'sholom embarrass Miriam. The opposite. The case of Miriam, according to the Ramban, is a case of a person who did a very, very small Avera. it's using Miriam because she is an example of a person who did a tiny Avera and yet is still held accountable. Kal v'chomer us, who may do, unfortunately, we hope not, much greater Averot, we have to be also very careful, specifically about our Lashon Hara, because we too will be held accountable. A different Perush, similar but not exactly the same, is given by the Rashbam. The Rashbam, again, the question is, why does it have to specifically mention the Avera of Miriam? Why not just talk about Lashon Hara? So the Rashbam answers a little bit differently from the Ramban. He notes that Miriam was a very important person in Klal Yisrael. She was the leader of all the women in Klal Yisrael in that generation. She had been a leader already when Bnei Yisrael were in Mitzrayim. And again, her emunah and her wisdom were unparalleled. And yet, says the Rashbam, Zachor et asher Hashem Elokecha leMiriam is teaching us that even very important leaders are still held accountable and still punished for their acts. According to the Rashbam, this teaches us a societal lesson that no one is above the halacha. No one should see themselves as beyond the law, that, those rules of ordinary people, they don't really apply to me. No, halacha is there for everybody. Halacha is egalitarian in that sense, that there is no person who, is beyond the law. There's no person who should say that, this doesn't really apply to me, I don't have to worry about the consequences. And therefore, for the Rashbam, this doesn't really focus on Lashon Hara per se, as much as it's teaching us a societal lesson about all people. That in the Torah, in God's eyes, all people are held accountable for their action. And therefore we remember the sin of Miriam not to remember anything bad that Miriam did, the opposite, but to learn Davka from the fact that she was so great and so important, and yet still accountable, a lesson for our own lives. So let's learn the lessons from this incident of Miriam, and again, not to think poorly of Miriam, chas v'shalom, because both the way that the Ramban and the Rashbam explain it, it's using Miriam as an example, not because of what she did, but because in the vast, overwhelming majority of her life, she was such a great leader, such a great tzaddiket, that we should all look up to. Have a great day.